right, friends, we are back to do another episode for this March transit. We're still at the beginning of the month. I'm supposed to do 22 videos. Technically, this is the third video, and it's going to be about Mercury ingressing into the sign of Aries from Pisces. And this Mercury cycle, the entire thing in March and April, is super significant because this is not just a passing Mercury. Mercury is going to station in the sign of Aries, start its retrograde at 9 degrees, go back into Pisces, revisit Neptune and North Node Rahu till it completes its cycle. So we're just going to talk about Mercury coming out of its debilitation and going into the sign of Aries and what all of this is saying. And as usual, I'm going to try to put this in the context of a bigger narrative, not just tell you guys what this signature means or what it can indicate in passing. I want to construct a larger picture because that's how we live our lives. And so far, I've done an overview of March transits, just putting that narrative into some sort of a context. I have done the video for Mercury conjunct Rahu, which occurs right before this ingress and with its conjunction to Neptune. And now we're moving on to the sign of Aries. And a little bit of housekeeping before I start. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment. Please comment. Let me know how these transits are unfolding for you. It lets me know how they actually manifest in other people's lives, which is very important in expanding our realm of horizon when it comes to understanding astrology. And you can also go to my website. I'm uploading the outlines, the writings, however way I'm grappling with the topic in the writing form and prepping for these videos. I'm taking it to the website and just keep uploading the same document, which is March's transit and its narratives. So you guys can go there and check it out at parisayazi.com. You can also find my reading services, classes, and any other kind of info you might be interested in. With that said, let us begin. Mercury ingress into the sign of Aries. An adventure awaits. So if we backtrack a little bit, on March 2nd, Mercury is conjunct Neptune at 29 degrees of Pisces, and the next day on March 3rd, Mercury ingresses into the sign of Aries. And at the 0 degrees of Aries, we're talking about critical degrees. So there's a lot of confusion. There's a planet transitioning from that water sign into a fodder sign, a fire sign. So there is a huge, I like to call this shock to the system. And in traditional astrology, whether we look at Vedic astrology or Western astrology, the Gandanta point or the anaretic degree, it's talking about some sort of a severe entanglement, that it's also very karmic, that we have to untie and unknot in order to be able to move forward in life. So with all the trauma that Mercury just went through in its debilitation, now we have arrived into the other side, past that threshold of Pisces into the sign of Aries, to untangle this knot. So we're talking about the dissolution of Mercury in the sign of Pisces, where it now has to ignite and initiate. And this is not easy for Mercury. In fact, it's not easy for any planets, but let's just see how Mercury is going to negotiate with all of this. One thing to remember, Mercury was just in a very nebulous kind of a state. It was a lot confusing for Mercury to be in the sign of Pisces. It was forced to be extremely introspective, and now it has to become very action-oriented in the sign of Aries. And we're going to understand that Mercury was just in a place where it just got stretched beyond all of its logical framework. It had to be in a very ambiguous place. All the lines and boundaries were all blurred. And as I was discussing in the Mercury-Rahu videos, Mercury actually needs those boundaries to be able to practice its power of discernment, because it's constantly discerning what is what and what is not another thing. In the sign of Pisces, this was non-existent. So we're talking about a kind of an exhausted Mercury now coming into a sign where it has to assert itself and act. It's kind of going from a place of where it had to rely on intuition, which Mercury is not very good at that, because intuition is telling us something about our inner sensation, feeling, subjectivity, and perception in that sense. Whereas now it's coming to Mars' sign, and Mars represents logic. So suddenly, from that intuitive sense, Mercury has to switch gears and become super logical. And it's in this that we get to now see, because when we're in the middle of a hardship, a lot of times we know it's hard, but we don't realize how much crap we went through till it's all said and done. So now we're starting to get a glimpse of, oh my God, that's what it meant for Mercury to be debilitated. That's what it meant for my mind to be under so much restraint now that I am out of that environment. So we're also getting this clear glimpse of what it meant to be in the sign of Pisces. And you know, the sign of Aries is not a friend sign to Mercury. In traditional astrology and Vedic astrology, when we think about planetary friendships, Mercury doesn't mind Mars, the ruler of Aries, but Mars despises Mercury. So it's saying that Mars is not generally going to be supportive to Mercury's function. And that's because Mars is a straightforward path. I've said this in other videos. It's going in a straight trajectory from point A to B. Mercury zigzags. So Mercury can do that forward thing that Mars wants it to do, but Mars doesn't do this back and forth. Mars is just going forward. So when Mars gets stuck with Mercury, it's just like, this guy is so annoying. Like, what are you doing? It's got that kind of a feel. So Mars is not friends to Mercury. So the sign of Aries too is not the most comfortable placement for Mercury. However, coming out of its debilitation, being even Mars' sign is a kind of a liberation for Mercury. And one of the reasons for this is it's going from that muddy, muggy kind of a feel, and it's just being reborn with a sharp sense of awareness suddenly. It can actually take its thought and have some practical application for it, instead of being in the sign of Pisces where it was just constantly dealing with these abstract insights where it couldn't really do it. It couldn't even express it. And this is a planet of communication. It wants to express it. In a way, we can visualize this Mercury coming into the sign of Aries is like Mercury is coming out of the ocean. And right at the shoreline, there's a lot of fog at that 0 degrees because that water is being evaporated by the fires of Aries. And Mercury slowly making its way out of the fog. And as soon as it's going to pass this fog, this 0 degrees, once when it's fully in the sign of Aries, Mercury is going to feel that cardinal initiating aspect of the sign of Aries, which is about pure initiation. The instincts kick in to act and to react constantly. And it's also a sign of individuation. Like Pisces is the last sign of the zodiac. And it's kind of taking everything and just dissolving, merging, dissolving, making it undifferentiated. It becomes a environment of potential without differentiation and individuation. And then what is spring? Everything just bursts back into life. It is about that initiating and individuating season. So when Mercury goes here too, Mercury is going to get that inceptive feeling that it needs to initiate and individuate. And Aries is a very individualistic sign. So Mercury went from that place of being merged and submerged. Now it has to assert itself, its individual self through its intellect. And again, when I say Mercury does this, we're doing this. I'm just universalizing the language, as I mentioned in the last video, so that we understand what the functions of these planets are and how they're operationalizing different facets of our experience and our life, or at least describing or symbolizing it. Going back, one of the things that Mercury, the way we can interpret Mercury in the sign of Pisces, the intellect becomes very indecisive because of those boundaries not being there, not having demarcations. So Mercury couldn't have direct thinking. That's why Mercury had to depend on that sense of intuition. But when it comes to the sign of Aries, now it's coming to possess bold speech, for example. It comes to have a kind of assertion of itself and its individual expression with a lot of confidence. And it can now act what it's thinking without hesitation. And it's kind of like now Mercury is coming to break out of some sort of a mental stagnation. And Aries is giving it a sense of urgency to act. And it's giving it a kind of a momentum to move forward. And one of the downsides of this is that it can make the mind very restless, especially coming out of Pisces in that initial degree once when it makes that ingress. Like if we were to imagine Mercury here in the sign of Aries, especially in that first few degrees, it's lacking any kind of patience. It doesn't have patience. And that, as I just said, is because of where it just came out of. So it's in a rebutting mode. It feels its own sense of sharpness and it's just ready to come back. It's just anything that you say to it now, that sharpness of the intellect actually feels good. There's gratification in that because of where it was. It felt a little dull. Its mind does not keep drifting into some abstraction where it can't be linear and can't be Mercury. Like it's fully activated and engaged now. And you know, poor Mercury had another problem in Pisces too. The ruler of Pisces, it's also in its mode of being in its exile in the sign of Gemini. So Mercury was just getting super bombarded. It was as if it was like in a mode of receptivity, absorbing knowledge and information, but not being able to put all of the components together to be able to understand what was happening. So the first feeling that we're going to get out of Mercury coming into the sign of Aries is its sharpness. We're not going to get that diplomatic part of Mercury, that discerning part of Mercury that's trying to keep the balance and the symmetry between things, simply because of where it came out of. You know what it's like? It's kind of like you could be a person who has generally a lot of etiquette. You eat slowly, you pay attention, you take your time to chew your food. But if you've been put in a state of starvation for, let's say, 3 days, the minute you come across food, you're going to eat like a savage. You might even stick your head into the plate and rip it with your hand and just be grotesque with it. And Mercury kind of has that feel because of the kind of deprivation that it just experienced in terms of its intellect not being so sharp and functional. So when it comes in the sign of Aries, it's almost as if it's trying to make up for lost times. It needs to assert itself to have a sense that it even exists. So it's coming out sharp and very unfiltered. And it comes out very determined. You know, when you first get a thought about what you want to do in life, you have this enormous sense of fire and determination that you're going to do this. But as the days turns into weeks to months, maintaining that fuel becomes something that needs to be more strategic and smart. But at the get-go, you're just going on raw determination. And that's how Mercury feels at this 0 degrees when it does its first ingress into the sign of Aries. So this very feeling that Mercury has is going to start to cause a lot of the problems that we're going to feel in the sign of Aries, which is going to demonstrate how Mercury is in a better place, but not in an ideal place. It's not in a sign that brings out the best of Mercury. And the best of Mercury is about being relational. It's about being neutral, diplomatic, systematic. Mercury wants to, it's about friendship. It's about itself, but it's also about you. And it's constantly trying to maintain this balance to go back and forth through its neutrality and diplomacy. It's even playful. That's the nature of Mercury. But when it comes into the sign of Aries, the only focus right now is how do I reclaim myself, especially in the sign of Pisces, where it had to merge and be about other people. And I explained this in the Rahu Mercury conjunction video, because we had a Kazimi point early in February and the sign of Aquarius. So Mercury was trying to collaborate with other people. And then it got so enmeshed with them that it was just like, this is confusing. Now, when it comes into the sign of Aries, it needs to differentiate. It needs to identify itself. It needs to assert itself and reclaim itself. And if we do this too harshly and be too hard about this, we are talking about distortion of Mercury's symbolism, which is about that relational dynamic and being diplomatic and so forth. In a lot of ways, Mercury here wants to separate to declare its own individual self. And the self here, we're talking about the intellect, like this is how I think. This is how I would do it. And just a lot of declaration of what it thinks, rather than taking into consideration how others might think. And this is just such a sharp departure from what happened in Pisces. And I guess a question we have to pose to ourselves is like, okay, we're getting this self-orientation and we got to ask ourselves, how boldly am I going to go pursue this? And how much of this boldness is actually selfishness? Because there's a strong drive to shed that passivity that Mercury had to go through in the sign of Pisces. And we also have to remember, it's not like Mercury scot-free now and it's like, I'm going to just I don't know, be me and do me and be about me, because this Mercury is going to station at 9 degrees of Aries and eventually it has to go back to the sign of Pisces. And specifically, it has to hit Neptune and Rahu one more time. So these are not finished. This is not a finished business for Mercury. And if we're not careful and we are separating too sharply and being too hot-headed, we're going to have to revisit what the consequences of this is or are going to be once when Mercury dips back again. So it's very important that we be self-aware of how we feel compelled to assert ourselves and to declare what I think in this moment. So the point here right now is, okay, we're compelled to move quickly, but think about it. And we're even coming to some sort of a conclusion in our mind, in our thinking process, without fully processing the kind of lessons that were taught in Pisces. We have to do that before we enact it. And Aries is very much egging Mercury on to act it out. And poor Mercury, we can't really blame it. We can't blame ourselves. It's like after that meeting with Rahu and Neptune, it's almost as if Mercury went through some sort of a cognitive trauma. And now it seems like in Aries, the ruler Mars has handed Mercury a weapon to go defend itself. It's a weapon of retaliation for immediate solutions and immediate actions, immediate answers, and just to use our cognitive capacity to full force go forward. And this transition actually feels like a cognitive whiplash in a lot of ways. And it's just making the mind, making the intellect, Mercury, ourselves to feel like we have to right now in this very moment move from uncertainty to certainty, from the process of introspection to the process of externalization. There's just this compulsive need to proclaim something right now. The planet of communication really wants to say something, but we have to be mindful of what's fueling this need and what exactly is it that it wants to say. And again, we have to consider where Mars is, right? Because Mars is the ruler of Aries. And Mars itself, it's in its own debilitation right now in the sign of Cancer. It's not going retrograde anymore. It's got a forward gaze, but it is still in a reactive mode because it is in the sign of Cancer. It's still insisting on protecting and using its energy in that kind of a way. So it's got an emotional impulse in terms of how Mars wants to act. It's all coming from that kind of a place. And the way that Mars is fueling Mercury is with this same kind of protective instinct. And in the sign of Aries, what is it trying to protect? The individual self, because of that self-orientation in the sign. So it's talking about self-protection, self-preservation, for the sake of self-assertion. In a way, Mars is sharpening the swords of Mercury's words as weapons. It's just, we're going to say things. We're going to say things that is actually about self-protection and self-preservation. And I was explaining in the last video, we made some alliances with other people when Sun and Mercury had that Kazimi point in Aquarius. We became too entangled and we really want to separate and individuate. But we have to be mindful, again, because this Mercury is going to go back. And honestly, if we're going to do this right, let's say we have that level of consciousness, because some people do. And you know what? There are human beings who will not have that inner compulsion or the impulse to act with these transits, the feelings and the modalities that they're indicating in the world because of their such deep degree of self-knowledge. If we are affected by it, it's saying that we're still unconscious about certain things. These transits in reality of astrology, are augmenting our consciousness. So if we could say that Mercury here has a lesson, the way that we need to become conscious in this world, the lesson that is trying to impart. It is, how do you integrate the lessons of Pisces and weave them into Aries, and then from Aries back into Pisces, and then from Pisces back into Aries. So in a sense, it's talking about how do you have this reconciliation between thoughts and intuition, fluidity with form, the merged and the unified with the distinct and the individuated? How do you hold surrender and assertion at the same time? These are the lessons that we have to learn. When Mercury was in the sign of Pisces, it was just lump-sided and things that are about Pisces. Now that it's coming into Aries, it's going to be all lump-sided about Aries topics. But this back and forth is telling us that we need to reconcile and merge and bring these components together. This is the kind of consciousness that we're trying to build, or things that we need to become conscious of. For example, one of the questions that we can ask ourselves, okay, how do I take that Piscean insight, which is quite abstract in a lot of ways, and have the capacity and the capability to communicate it? How do I not stab the fabric of existence, the way things are so coherent and weaved into each other, this beautiful tapestry, and at the same time make my own personal imprint on it to exist within it? It's just that individual and that collective component has to come to some sort of a negotiation point. Or, for example, how do I assert myself, have my own personal integrity, my sense of individuality, but don't lose sight of the importance of connections to other people? And we got to remember that last solar eclipse in the sign of Aries, which is happening at the same exact degree where Mercury is going to station to go retrograde, which is at 9 degrees. What is that axis telling us? Aries-Libra, the assertion of the individual self and its individuation in opposition to how we cooperate with others and connect with them. So this is a kind of a lesson right now being taught to our intellect, to Mercury, through this transit. And it's going to be intense. Mercury is a huge player in the month of March, especially because of this connection to the solar eclipse also. In a lot of ways, Mercury in that dreamscape of Pisces has come to the battlefield of Aries to fight for itself, but we got to understand how to incorporate the self with the many. And this mini concept, Mercury is going to have to re-experience it when it goes back into Pisces again. In a lot of ways, this journey of Mercury is about refining our concept of relationship with the concept of selfhood. And I think one of the greatest indicators to understand when and how this is happening is to pay attention to ourselves and to be when we're being defensive. Like in the way that we try to assert ourselves to reclaim our voice and our opinion, how I'm expressing my thoughts, how I want things to be. When it's too strong, when we're insisting a little too much, it's a good point to start thinking about, wait a minute, am I like blurring the lines here right now? I know there's another funny component happening with this Mercury transit, because not only Mercury has made it into the sign of Aries and everything that we talked about, and there's a solar eclipse, Mercury is going to come into conjunction with Venus also, and it's a retrograde Venus. And this has a lot to do with how do we reconcile the mind and the heart. We know that these two components of the self are not always aligned. So it's kind of like, how do we balance self-assertion with some sort of an emotional wisdom? Because we know when we're really cerebral, we lack empathy for other people. That's one of the first markers of how we get disconnected from other human beings, how we're not understood and how we misunderstand other people. It's really about how do we communicate our needs assertively, but also take other people's need into consideration. We're negotiating that weird fine line between asserting our individual will and the relational dynamics that exist around us, where they too have their own will. So we have to learn how to dance with this, and that connection with Venus is very much bringing this to the forefront. And there's another point in the sign of Aries with Mercury. Mercury is going to come to its second Kazimi with the sun. And I feel that all that, almost as if Mercury, the intellect, the intelligence that we have within, lost its confidence in the sign of Pisces. That's why it's trying to be so forceful and reclaim and proclaim in the sign of Aries as soon as it gets in there. But sun, that ultimate power, when Mercury comes into conjunction with it at the same exact degree and that Kazimi point, it's almost as if it's giving Mercury its authentic soul level confidence back. And when we have that, it's really easy for us to keep some space, open some space for other people to be themselves, to express themselves. And we don't feel threatened. We don't feel less than. We don't feel like anything's being taken from us. So we're going to go through all these modes, but I feel the saving grace of having that moment of illumination to start to understand what all of this means is when Mercury and Sun are at that Kazimi point. And that doesn't happen till March 24th, when Mercury is actually in its retrograde motion at 4 degrees, where they come into a conjunction. Mercury and Sun come into an exact degree conjunction. And I think the way that Mercury is going to unfold in the sign of Aries is it's getting all the self lessons. And it's starting to have inclinations of what it means to have this reconciling process of self and other. But it's not really going to get internalized till we move into April, and Mercury is going to go back into Pisces and make those same conjunctions with Rahu and Neptune again. Mind you, though, it's going to meet Neptune in the sign of Aries, which is also quite telling, but I'll leave that for future transits as we'll talk about them. And I would argue that our intellect, Mercury, comes to have a great understanding of this lesson being imparted to us, and we become conscious of what it means to have a healthy sense of self, to have an intellect that's connected with it in that way, but also at the same time know what it means to have a sense of integration and cohesion with other people that is outside this boundary of the self. So that 9-degree point is probably the most critical degree for first Mercury, because that is exactly where it self-stations and goes retrograde. And also for Venus, because Venus stations at 10 degrees and it starts its retrograde motion. So we're gonna have these lessons deeply entrenched enough that it will carry us through till we have K2 South Node return back into this axis and start the eclipses in Aries and Libra again, which is actually quite telling to think that K2 South Node is going to come back and to continue the story. But that won't be till summer of 2034, so we can breathe, especially those of us who have planets in Aries and Libra. That was brutal. So we got a little bit of time, but it's setting the stage for the next cycle coming up. And if we're fortunate enough to live long enough to make it to those years, then we got more lessons coming our way. And just to conclude, it's worth remembering that Mercury is coming to Aries and it's very eager to speak its mind, and aggressively, boldly. It wants to declare what it knows and what it knows about who it is and what it knows about who you're not and how it relates to you or doesn't relate to you. But this retrograde is going to show what you think you know and what you think you have to express is not necessarily what you know, and maybe you shouldn't have expressed it as aggressively as you did. And one of the lessons we can take from this is that true clarity in life doesn't just come from assertion of what we think and who we are and how we want to communicate that. A lot of time, clarity is connected to returning back to something, sitting with it, reflecting on it, using that intellect in that process of introspection, which is Pisces, right? So it's talking about reintegrating things. That's how we grow and that's how we expand our horizon. So this is kind of a lesson that we're being taught. So in a lot of ways, we could sum it up by saying the ultimate lesson for Mercury, when it's all said and done, is about how can boldness be tempered with wisdom. The sign of Pisces, which is owned by Jupiter, which is representing that which has emerged, been incorporated. There's a sense of wholeness and depth to it, is saying something about wisdom. And then, on the other hand, how can wisdom that's become embodied, like that inclusion, that incorporation of it within us, where we are now just an embodiment of it, how do we enact it? How do we express it? How do we communicate it? How do we take this self now with this kind of intellect and this kind of understanding and connect ourselves with other people? So I think I'm going to leave it off here. I hope you guys have a fantastic Mercury in Aries ingress. May our mind be fully awakened, but not obnoxious. Signing off, sending you much love. Till next time.